The newly released Avengers Endgame marks the ending of what they're calling the Infinity Saga, which is the first 22 movies of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, going from Iron Man all the way until Avengers Endgame, which is the creation of the Avengers and the subsequent battle between the Avengers and Thanos. That was the ending of the Marvel Cinematic Universe's first saga and first 11 years, which was Avengers Endgame. Now, with that saga ending, I'm going to be ranking all 22 movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, I know I could really wait till Spider-Man Far From Home to do this video, because after that there is not another Marvel movie coming out for a pretty long time, but the reason I'm doing it now is because this is not a ranking of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, really. It's a ranking of the Infinity Saga movies, and that is a video that will never really need to be updated, because every movie going forward is not connected at all to this saga, so every movie from Iron Man to Avengers Endgame will be ranked here in this video, and I'll give the score, give a short review. The scores might be a little different from what I've given it in the past, and I will explain why at the end of this video. So with all that in mind, let's begin this video with number 22. The Incredible Hulk is one of the first movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and that was before the universe and the studio really found its footing. This is a fairly boring and basically completely filler movie for not only the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but also the character of Bruce Banner and also the Hulk. Because of the recasting, because of the changes they've made to the Hulk, The Incredible Hulk is not necessarily a movie you need to watch, not even just for the story of the saga, but also for the character of Bruce Banner. The character development is completely thrown out the window by the fact that he was recast, and that's not the fault of the movie, but it still means that this is not the greatest movie in this universe. There is some cool action, although there's not much of it, but the fight between the Hulk and the Abomination at the end is definitely one of the better end fight scenes in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and because of that, the Abomination himself is definitely a pretty memorable villain, but in the end, The Incredible Hulk is definitely the least memorable movie in this universe, and is generally agreed upon to be the worst movie in this universe as well, which is why it's number 22 on this list. Thor: The Dark World definitely has its moments in both comedy and action, and also it's slightly emotional at times, and it's definitely very important to the Infinity Saga, as it does introduce the Ether and is definitely heavily mentioned in Avengers Endgame, but that doesn't really save the movie from its incredibly boring and incredibly convoluted plot, which is made much worse by the pretty horrible villain in Malekith and the Dark Elves. Iron Man 2 feels like mostly set up for the future of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is fine, don't get me wrong. I think that the first phase of this universe actually kind of benefited from the setup that Iron Man 2 had. It introduced certain characters very well as well, but that does not help Iron Man 2 as a movie. It did not benefit Iron Man 2 as a movie. This is not a movie that really feels like it stands alone. It doesn't feel like a movie that you can watch without having to watch another movie afterwards, which is fine because of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but for Iron Man 2 on its own, I don't think it's a very good one. It has a lot of good action and some very memorable scenes, but with all the setup kind of distracting from the main plot and the just horrible main villain in Whiplash, Iron Man 2 definitely is not as good as the original and falls mostly flat.
Tech available for me.
No, I did.
Ant-Man and the Wasp was not fortunate in its placement in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, coming right after Infinity War. This movie felt especially filler with most of its plot, and it didn't even have a plot for the most part. It's definitely very funny, but not nearly as funny as its predecessor, and again, there isn't really much of a plot either. That being said, the Quantum Realm is incredibly interesting, and obviously, if you watched Endgame, incredibly important. It's probably the key to beating Thanos, or to saving the world in Endgame, which definitely saved saved the movie from being completely pointless, especially that end credit scene, but you can genuinely just skip this movie and just watch the end credit scene, and you will be good for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This is not a movie that I thought was very enjoyable for the most part. It definitely was fun and funny, but for the most part, I felt definitely like it was a movie that did not need to exist except for the end credit scene. So with that in mind, it is very low on this list because of it.
I'm not what you think I am.
Captain Marvel suffers from a couple things, like a pretty bland main actress who it seems like half the world hates her, or half the internet hates her, at least, and I'm on board with that. I do not like Brie Larson at all, and I tried to separate the character from the actress, and I do think Brie Larson is definitely not a bad actress at all, but it feels like the way she is in real life definitely bleeds into the character just a little bit. There is absolutely no unique visual style. It's a very bland visual style. I mean, most of it looked and felt exactly like Star Wars, except for like right at the end when Captain Marvel just used her full powers at the end, which definitely looked pretty cool, but for the most part it had absolutely no visual style. It had a pretty boring plot and some clear and very forced political commentary, as well as some clear and pretty forced feminism as well. That being said, again, I would be lying if I didn't get excited when Captain Marvel finally used her powers at the end and went all out with the powers. Visual style was definitely very interesting, which is why I'm not completely against a sequel to this movie, but in the end, Captain Marvel, just like the movie that came right before it, Ant-Man and the Wasp, does not feel like a movie that I would personally ever watch again, and it doesn't feel like a movie that necessarily needed to exist in between Infinity War and Endgame.
I will return.
An otherwise great introduction to Thor, as well as the main villain of the Avengers, Loki, two fan-favorite characters who weren't exactly introduced as the fan-favorite characters in this movie, but I do think the way they are in this movie, especially Thor, who is vastly different now than he was introduced very, very well in this movie. This movie is definitely very enjoyable, some pretty good action as well, but it is pretty much ruined by the insistence on focusing on the human characters, as well as choosing basically the lamest looking place on Earth to have most of its action. I do think Thor could have been a lot better, but that being said, I still really like this movie. I really like the music as well, and the main villain, Loki, definitely saves it from being a genuinely bad movie.
Just good old-fashioned revenge.
Iron Man 3 is mostly very fun with a very cool visual flair as well as some heart as well. That being said, obviously, I agree with most people when I say the Mandarin twist is one of the stupidest moments in the Marvel Cinematic Universe ever, which kind of ruins this movie. Not because I ever loved the Mandarin in the comics. In fact, I was, when this movie came out especially, I knew nothing about Iron Man, I knew nothing about the character or his villains, but what I did know is during the movie, the actual Mandarin they had was a great villain up until the twist, which completely ruined him. This new Mandarin that we had in the movie was so uninspired and so boring compared to the Mandarin we had before. For most of the movie, I think Iron Man 3 was easily the best movie in this trilogy with an insanely good villain, but that twist very much ruined it, and it probably kept it from being way higher on this list. Instead, it's only at number 16, which is, I think, a shame because this movie has a lot of great things about it.
The revolution will be live.
Black Panther is probably the most overrated superhero movie of all time, especially by critics. Black Panther suffers from a lot of things like terrible CGI, which should not be in a 2018 Marvel movie with such a high budget, and a main character who was way cooler in both Captain America Civil War as well as Avengers Endgame. I feel like this is the character who was handled so much better by the Russo brothers compared to how he was handled here by the director Ryan Coogler. Killmonger is definitely one of the best villains in the MCU, and Wakanda is a very interesting interesting setting, and this movie has a lot of great things about it, but I feel like Black Panther definitely has a lot of faults that were also ignored completely by the critics, but not necessarily by the fans, which is why Black Panther is not my favorite movie in this universe, but I do like a lot of things about it.
There are no strings on me.
Age of Ultron is somewhat of the kind of black sheep of the Avengers quadrilogy, and if you want to count Captain America Civil War, which feels like an Avengers movie, then the Quint trilogy, as it's nowhere near the top of this list. It has a lot of stupid things about it, although I do think Ultron is a very good villain, and watching the Avengers together is always a lot of fun, and I feel like the movie is actually more fun than its predecessor, but there's also a lot of dumb action that kind of like turn off your brain action that I don't necessarily think that the other Avengers movies or even the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a whole has, or it's not a problem at all for most of the movies. There is some dumb writing, some character development that really doesn't work, and certain relationships like between the Hulk and the Black Widow that comes out of nowhere, and it's something that didn't necessarily need to exist at all, and they don't handle it very well either, as well as some dumb moments like Quicksilver's untimely death or Thor's exposition pool. A lot of dumb things in this movie that drag down an otherwise very, very fun movie with a great villain. A great start to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Iron Man introduces the titular hero flawlessly in a movie with a great character arc, great comedy as well as good action that made Iron Man a household name. The villain isn't great, and I feel like this movie, although it was a great start, it has definitely been overshadowed by a lot of the movies that came afterwards, and I don't think Iron Man is as groundbreaking now as it was before, but I definitely have to acknowledge its significance in starting this universe.
What were you the god of again?
The best thing about Thor Ragnarok is the reinvention of the character of Thor, breaking him out of his fairly boring shell, and I don't think Infinity War would have been the same without these changes. Obviously, Endgame didn't really use these changes at all, but I feel like they will go back to this version of Thor after Endgame. Ragnarok is very, very funny, kind of to a fault, as it does kind of take away from the emotion and epicness of the movie, and I feel like with the emotion and with the epicness that this movie lacked because of the over-reliance on comedy, Thor Ragnarok could have been one of the best movies in this universe. Instead, it's right near the middle of this list as a very, very good movie. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is a worthy sequel to the original with hilarious comedy, a great team dynamic, great visuals, as well as a kind of even better villain, in fact, way better villain in Ego than the original movie, than its predecessor. That being said, Volume 2 is for some reason inarguably less memorable than Volume 1. It isn't as strong in some regards, and although I feel like the two movies are very close in their quality, Volume 2 is definitely just a teeny bit worse than its predecessor, for a number of reasons that I really can't think of. I just think that it's a lot less memorable.
I don't know if I can do this. This is why you've been chosen.
Probably the most underrated Marvel Cinematic Universe movie ever, the first Avenger perfectly tells Captain America's origin story in a pretty cleverly used 1940s setting, and World War II with one of the most compelling, if not the most compelling love stories in this series between Steve and Peggy. The villain Red Skull is great as well, and the ending is just the icing on the cake to end this movie. I enjoy this movie quite a lot, and I don't understand why it has such a low rating on IMDb. I think it definitely deserves a lot better.
For you.
Doctor Strange has incredible and very unique visuals with a very compelling main character as well. The ending is very fun and clever in the way Strange defeats Dormammu, who is not really the main villain, but I think that the time loop that Strange uses is a very clever twist on just the hero versus the villain ending of a superhero movie. The villain, who is not Dormammu, it's Caecilius, is definitely not great, and the love story in the background between Doctor Strange and I can't even remember her character, like I think it was Night Nurse, Rachel McAdams' character. It's definitely a love story that it feels very out of place, but as a whole, Doctor Strange hits most of its marks and introduces a character who is one of the better characters in this universe, and this movie is definitely very important to the overall Infinity Saga. Guardians of the Galaxy is fun, heartfelt, extremely funny, with very compelling main characters as well as character arcs for the Guardians, great visuals and action as well as some pretty emotional moments. Volume 1 is definitely one of the most memorable movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it's the movie that proved to everyone that Marvel can essentially do and pull off anything. Ant-Man is another movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe that I feel like is very overlooked as to how good it actually is. The shrinking effect of Ant-Man gives it a very unique visual style that really works for the movie. The titular main character of Ant-Man, or Scott Lang, is one of the best main characters in the universe as well, very compelling. But I think the best thing about Ant-Man is the comedy, as in my opinion, Ant-Man has got to be the funniest movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Regardless of how good this movie was going to be, I feel like Homecoming was going to be one of my favorite movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe just because Spider-Man as a character is my favorite superhero, and Tom Holland's portrayal, just based off Civil War, is the quintessential live-action portrayal of the character. But on top of all that, Homecoming is hilarious. It has a lot of great action and intense moments, as well as one of the best villains in the series, which is the Vulture, complete with a great twist that comes out of nowhere, that he is the father of Liz Allen, or I guess Liz Toombs, in this continuity. But I think Spider-Man Homecoming is one of my favorite movies in this universe, and I definitely cannot wait for Far From Home, which is coming out very soon. The Winter Soldier reinvents Captain America for a modern audience in the perfect way. The first Avenger used him in the 1940s, and in the Avengers he felt very out of place or very out of time. It felt like he was still in the 1940s, but the Winter Soldier brings him into the future and brings him into the present day, making him way more badass, way more relatable, and overall way more compelling. This movie has some great villains in the Winter Soldier, Alexander Pierce, and Hydra as a whole. A very intriguing and very well executed political thriller, kind of like spy movie plot, and because of that, Black Widow, this is their best movie as well if you don't count Endgame, but it all does a lot for one of the best and most exciting movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe that made Captain America the fan favorite character, maybe even more so than Iron Man himself, that he has become. The Avengers was maybe not the first, but the biggest impossible task that the Marvel Cinematic Universe had to pull off, although it definitely was not the last. They brought together 6 superheroes, 6 already established superheroes, in a very fun, action-packed, heartfelt, clever movie that assured that the Marvel Cinematic Universe would be sticking around for a long time, and I'm definitely not taking that for granted, because just looking at Justice League, it doesn't seem like a task that is very easy, but somehow they pulled it off.
No warning. I could do this all day.
Civil War continues the political thriller aspect of Winter Soldier and kind of improves on it, this time involving the rest of the Avengers except for Thor and the Hulk. Introducing Spider-Man and Black Panther was awesome on its own, and this was somehow Black Panther's best movie, but that was also somehow overshadowed by the gripping storytelling, the incredible action, and the emotional, intense conflict between our heroes of Captain America and Iron Man, or Team Cap and Team Stark, which was set in motion not only the events of Age of Ultron, and I really like that continuity, but also one of the better villains of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, one of the more underrated villains in the MCU, and that is Helmut Zemo. All of that is why Captain America Civil War was at one point my favorite movie of all time, but it has been dethroned not once, but twice.
I hope they remember you.
Captain America Civil War was previously dethroned as my favorite movie of all time by Avengers Infinity War just 2 years later. Avengers Infinity War has a perfect balance, as all things should be, between story, action, comedy, and emotion, which is all brought together by arguably the main character of the movie and inarguably one of the best villains and most influential villains in cinematic history, which is Thanos. I think that the action is very, very good, the story is very gripping, the comedy mostly lands, and it's spread out very well, and the emotion, especially Spider-Man's death scene and the snapping as a whole, was handled incredibly well. But in the end, Thanos is the main reason this movie is as good as it is, and I also think Infinity War has the best villain in Thanos in the entire series, but the villain isn't everything, and that is why Avengers Infinity War was also dethroned as my favorite movie of all time just 1 year later by
Back to me.
A movie epic like never seen before, Avengers Endgame flawlessly concludes 11 years and 22 movies of storytelling that all lead up to an insane, mind-bogglingly incredible movie complete with hilarious moments throughout, insane action and visuals, the perfect amount of fan service that make it all so worth it, as well as incredibly high emotionally perfect endings to the main characters of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Endgame is not only the best Marvel Cinematic Universe movie, not only the best superhero movie, but quite possibly the best movie of all time, as it concludes the greatest cinematic achievement and experience that is the Infinity Saga of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So that is the ending of this ranking. The reason that the scores are slightly different from what they have been in the past is because now I compared them to the standard of what can be a 10 out of 10, which is Avengers Endgame, which is why certain movies are slightly lower or maybe even slightly higher than they were before. I honestly didn't check my other rankings. I just gave them new scores just compared to the 10 that is Avengers Endgame. But let me know your ranking in the comments down below. Do you think Avengers Endgame is as good as I think it is? If you want to check out my review, my spoiler-free as well as spoiler review for Avengers Endgame's link will be in the top right corner of the video. But if you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and let me know if you are excited for Spider-Man Far From Home. But anyway, as always, thanks for watching.